Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Welcome back to The Curious Collector. I'm Stuart Holbrook, your host, and here today with episode 46 and 1, I am so excited to share with all of you in our series called Conversations with a Collector. And today I have on as a guest Bradley Justice Yarbrough, who is a wonderful and renowned character across a world of dolls. A lot of people just associate Bradley with Barbie, not just, but they think of him as far as Barbie collecting goes. And clearly he has been involved in that world for many, many years and a pinnacle collector as well as researcher, historian, documenting a lot of the history of the early days of Mattel and Barbie up into the current years, and both in the perspective of the development of the doll, but also in the collecting world too. Bradley, though, is, well, I guess you could call him a complex character because his passion for dolls extends far beyond just that. And we're going to focus today, yes, we'll talk about Barbie, but we're going to focus on also some of the other areas that he has collected over the years and how that has led to this lifetime of joy as his passionate collector extending from 19th century dolls all the way up to Barbie. Bradley, thank you so much for being here today. It's fabulous to have you on The Curious Collector. I've known you for years. You've been a great friend, and I think are one of the most intriguing and influential personalities out there in the world of collecting and obviously especially dolls. And I'm so glad you could be with us.
Stuart, thanks for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
You know, Bradley, we were joking when we were talking about doing a podcast together. I really wanted to do the concept of everything but the B word. That is, we try to do a whole podcast with you and we never mention Barbie once, because I think that would be the most shocking thing people have ever realized in association with you, because you are, I hate to use the word branded or branding, but you're branded out there quite a bit in people thinking of you as Barbie and related to the history of Barbie and the love of Barbie, but you're more complex than that. Complex, is that the word? Your collection goes a lot further. So before we get into talking about the aspect of you as a collector, tell us a little bit about this and frame this for people, how your collecting goes beyond just the B word.
Sure. A lot of people don't know that I do collect things other than the Mattel Barbie doll. I do a little bit of everything, but most everything has some sort of connection or correlation. I love a doll that has a wardrobe, or as I like to say, a supporting set of items like patterns, sewing patterns, or costumes, accessories. I love a doll that has stuff. So that kind of transcends like the last 200 years of dolls. But I'm kind of fascinated with some things that are sort of the antithesis of like Barbie. Like I adore the Kato Cruza dolls, the early ones. I love that sort of chubby German child. I love the 1920s. I love some hard plastics from the 50s. So I kind of, am fascinated with a lot of different things and research them and study them. Maybe not as much as Barbie, but I'm always fascinated and love learning about them.
That's fantastic. I talk about Barbie or anything that you begin your collection with and how you started as a collector as being a gateway, that it doesn't necessarily mean that's where you're going to stick forever. It may form the context of your collecting through your life, but it's just the entry point and it will expand from there. And you can see that in your own collecting, how Barbie evolved. So I guess at this point, before we talk about these other areas that you're into, talk a little bit about that gateway moment and how you got into collecting, how you grew up. I believe you grew up in North Carolina as a young lad, and how that person, that young man, became the collector Bradley that we know today.
Sure. I am from North Carolina, and at a very young age, I would say maybe 5 years old, we spent a summer with family where my mom grew up in the eastern part of North Carolina. And my cousin, who is a couple years older than me, she brought her carry case filled with her Barbies. And we probably sat on my grandmother's living room floor for hours playing Barbies every day. And I was fascinated with all the costumes and the dolls. And at the end of that week of us being there, my cousin Carolyn gave me one of the dolls. It wasn't Barbie, it was Barbie's friend Stacy. But I took that doll home and was just so entranced with it. And so we added a few dolls to the group, Malibu Ken and a Francie. And so I spent many hours playing with them. But around age 10, 11, 12, when you're kind of getting too old to play with your dolls and toys, I watched a television show that was called PM Magazine. And it was a syndicated television show that did a lot of human interest stories. And one of the things that they covered was a lady named Sybil DeWine, who had just written a book called The Collector's Encyclopedia of Barbie. And for me, it was realizing that what I loved and was fascinated with, there was so much more out there and that you could collect them. So I kind of switched from being the child playing with these things into a collector and trying to find more and more of those. And I will say my parents probably were not overly amused that their son was playing with dolls at a young age, but they tolerated it and were fine with it. But I think when I started collecting, I think both my parents kind of saw that there was sort of a method to the madness and sort of a means to an end, that I was buying and collecting something that may be of value, that may sort of pave my way to a future. And it's kind of ironic that at this moment is kind of like my whole being of like researching and studying and playing Barbie all over the world.
That's so fascinating. And yeah, the story you tell, interestingly enough, parallels a lot the interview I had with Bill Greening, who you know very well, who was a designer at Barbie, and your upbringing and your youth. And I think he mentioned the same thing, that he had a cousin or a neighbor or something that had Barbies, and they used to get together and play. And that evolved into more scholarly work and studying the history, and then led into his career. And you two have paralleled almost exactly the same storyline, went different directions, but still stayed within Barbie your whole lives. And that's so fascinating to me.
It's been very interesting to spend time with Bill and get to know him more and learn about his history, because it is very similar and there is a parallel. And I think there are a lot of collectors that probably share a same history. My parents were indulgent and let me play with dolls, but I have a lot of male collector friends that were denied that privilege. Their parents were very rigid and would not let them have a doll for whatever reason. And I think almost out of rebellion, they grew up to buy as many as they possibly could because they didn't have them as a kid and they always dreamed of having them.
You know, I have a term for that. It's called revenge collecting.
Oh, I do love a good revenge collection.
Revenge collections are the best. They really are. They
Absolutely.
often can make up some of the most passionate collectors. But you were not a revenge collector. And I think that ultimately led into, because you were able to do a lot of research, even at a young age. You were studying constantly the history of Mattel, the history of Barbie, and it led in today to your becoming one of the greatest historians on this particular subject. Was there a point when you realized that just having Barbies or being involved with Barbies in a play setting had morphed into you were now a collector?
I really would say that I was probably like 14, 15 years old, to where suddenly, I was plotting and planning acquisitions. I had devoured that book by Sybil DeWine and Joan Asherbranner and almost memorized it. And I would say, as an educated collector, is the best kind of collector, because you know what you're looking at, you know what you're seeing, you understand where it's from and how it was made. So it made me far more informed. So when I would go to the flea markets, the estate sales, the doll shows when I was young, I didn't have much of an allowance to spend. I mean, I was probably bringing in like $5 or $10 a week with allowance. So my spending budget was minimal, but it helped me make really good decisions in what to purchase. And I think kind of like realizing that I was studying something and then seeking it out and buying it, it was far more than just buying something a play. It was definitely creating a collection or using the word curation. I was curating what I was going to have in my collection. And that for me was really kind of the moment the light bulb went on to where I'm studying, learning, researching, and creating this collection.
An interesting takeaway from there. And I think one of the reasons I love doing these collector conversations is that other collectors can learn certain valuable lessons within these talks. And you just brought up something that I think is really poignant and a beautiful lesson in that you said the challenges you had as a young collector, and that challenge was financial. You had a few dollars to spend going out, actually led to your becoming a better collector because you were forced to make really smart decisions along the way. You didn't just jump in willy-nilly. You had to be calculating with everything you did.
Absolutely. And even though I had sort of like that small monthly budget to spend on Barbie, keep in mind that this was like 1981, 82, 83 when I'm starting this. The prices of the vintage Barbies at the time, by today's standards, were very inexpensive. Mod dolls were like $5 to $10, and a good bubble cut was maybe $20. A number 5 ponytail might have been $35. So, I mean, it was a much more affordable time to be collecting, but as cheap as the prices were, they were expensive to me on that budget. So I was very lucky to have some great scores during that time, but I think those were all as a result of my paying attention and studying, and then also meeting some other collectors early on that helped educate me and point things out to me, which, I always say the camaraderie of doll friends and learning with a mentor is probably one of the best things you could ever do.
Absolutely. And we talk about this in the previous podcast I did, community and collecting, and how that can work to your advantage so often in the networking part of collecting, in finding good objects, learning about oddball things that you didn't even realize that other people identify with, and that it all kind of connects. So great lessons there. But I think the best lesson takeaway you came out with is that adversity at times can be your friend in your collecting because it forces you to make good decisions. So for those who may be on limited budgets right now, younger and in the world of collecting and feeling like they're challenged, that's okay. And Bradley, you are an example of how, if you're patient and you work over the years, can evolve into becoming a truly great collector and teach you that discipline. So that's a great lesson. Thank you, Bradley, for that.
My pleasure.
Okay, so you're coming into those teen years where you're involved and you were specifically focused on Barbie at that point. You hadn't really discovered anything else?
No, I was aware that people were collecting other kinds of dolls. This is the 80s, so a lot of people were collecting Madame Alexander. It was such a big thing at the time, but I was Barbie focused.
You were totally Barbie focused. So who you mentioned about some of these influential early people. Do you want to give a few of them a shout out and some of the people that really inspired you? Yeah, in Barbie.
Absolutely. My friend Elizabeth McGee sat up at like a antique show in Greensboro, and she always had this big display case full of like vintage Barbie. And it all seemed so unaffordable to this like 12-year-old kid that was staring at it. But she was very patient, and she would bring things out and show them to me and explain things. And that was just as much of a great lesson as reading the book, because you were seeing the object in real time. And she was very patient and very kind. And I think she probably thought, like, what is this 12-year-old kid doing looking at all these old Barbies? But she's pretty much who I spent my money with. And so as I continued to collect, I was even then becoming more and more focused. And what we ended up doing is the things that I would acquire in like a collection that I had no interest in, I would bring them to her and she would apply them to purchases. So that allowed me to get things that were kind of out of my budget because she was getting something she knew she could market and sell. So she was very kind to me. We became lifelong friends, and she passed away in 2019, but we had been friends since I was like 12 years old.
It's such an inspiring story in the sense of how we relate to young collectors. And you see so many collectors, established collectors, kind of, I don't know, they're not pushing away younger collectors, but they don't really understand and realize that there are those out there that are really hungry to learn, and they may not have the money or may not have the collection or be involved in collecting the same things you do on that same level, but you can inspire them at that young age and lead them down the sordid path of collecting.
Oh, exactly.
And that it really is impactful, and it shaped you.
It really did shape me, and it really kind of taught me a few life lessons. She was very embracing of me, in spite of my means, in spite of my age, and we grew to be really good friends. And in turn, I've tried to do the same thing to a lot of younger collectors, sharing my love, my passion, my history of what I've learned, and share my knowledge. You know, I love working with younger people because we all come to this collecting hobby with like a different perspective and with collecting for different reasons. And it's real interesting for me to learn about why and how people collect. And I always like to, as you said, corrupt a young collector and take them down this dark, sordid road of Barbie collecting. It's a lot of fun.
It is. And mentorship is such an important aspect in anything we do in our lives. And collectors talk about how they're always so worried. Oh, I want to know there's young collectors coming into collecting. But the reality comes to be the mentorship aspect of this is the critical missing part of a lot of the interaction that's developing new young collectors. And that mentorship is so important to embrace young people and teach them. And so this is another great lesson as well that you've provided. What was it like back then? I mean, I have memories of the Barbie world in the early 80s, and it was pretty dynamic, and it was pretty popular, and there were a lot of people involved in it, but it was very different than today's Barbie collecting.
It was so different. And what I will tell you is the Barbie collectors, they got organized. They figured this out. And my other person that was very inspiring to me was a lady by the name of Ruth Kronk. And she also had been sort of a force of collecting early on. I think she started in like the early 70s. Her daughter went off to college and she found her daughter's Barbies and loved them, and then started acquiring those at like yard sales. But she sat down with her electric typewriter and started a newsletter called the Barbie Gazette. And she ran an ad in, I think, like some of the doll magazines at the time and some other like antique trade magazines, and created this whole network of collectors. And they would share stories about finding stuff and where to look for things and ask questions like, you know, does anybody know what this is? So it was this very sort of grassroots effort of bringing the collector community together. And she helped organize and was sort of the leader for the very first National Barbie Collectors Convention in 1980. And I would say probably 82, 83, there used to be like a little magazine thing called the Parade magazine that came with the Sunday paper. And I think someone had written in and said something about like, you know, I found my old Barbie, is it worth anything? And they referred to her and that she had this newsletter. So I begged my mom at the time to write out like the $3 check for a yearly subscription and subscribe to that newsletter. And so that also collected me to other people. And I recently had a conversation with my nieces who I'm kind of bringing into the collector world, and they collect a lot of things as well. But I was telling them that when I started, there was a thing called the list, and people would do like a mail order list, and they would list all of the dolls they had for sale and describe them in detail and put a price to it. And so you would send a self-addressed stamped envelope to them, and they would mail you the list, and then you would call them and make sure the doll was available, and then you would mail them a check, and they would wait for the check to clear, and they would mail you the doll. So a transaction took like a month. So it was an exercise in patience back then. But back then there were only like doll shows, flea markets, and antique shows to like find this stuff. And that was sometimes dependent upon the season. A lot of those things didn't happen in the wintertime. So you had to have some form of connection to sort of get your Barbie fix. And that was the thing. Many people early on, like Ruth Kronk, they created this network, which still exists to this day, thanks to that tenacity.
It's so interesting as well because you think a lot about certain categories of collecting. Here we use dolls really as the formation for a lot of our ideas and thoughts, but it's really in anything you collect. often one person can be the catalyst for an entire organized market developing, one that may have been fragmented before. People had not come together or even knew what they were doing. They were just doing it. One person leads the whole journey forward. Here's an example we'll talk about. I know you have a love of Japan, and I've been interested in how collecting of antique dolls developed in Japan. And it was very similar to what you described with the early Barbie Gazette, in that there was one collector in Japan who was fascinated with French dolls and European dolls from the 19th century. And she started this little newsletter that she used to print in her house, that she would take to different friends who also found some fascination in dolls. And this newsletter became like a cult following in Japan, and it actually inspired an entire network of collecting. She's the one who coined the term Sawako Eden Bebe, if you've ever heard of that, Bradley.
I have
it's
not.
It's a certain French Eden Bebe that has this one particular smile that I swear to God, only the Japanese can ever really tell me what it is because it's so nuanced. But it's some identification of this Eden Bebe that she described as having a smile like the dewy morning. And collectors loved this. And there was a period in time in the 90s and early 2000s that this Sawako Eden Bebe was bringing like $30,000.
Oh, my God. That collector saw this and just went crazy for it and then created the whole market behind it.
Created the entire market. One person. And so what you're talking about is very similar. And there's so many other categories of doll collecting out there that really came out of the research and the promotion of one person talking about it. And then everybody saying, oh, that's cool. I want to collect those as well. And then it just expands from there. But you know, Barbie back in the 80s, in the early 80s, it was really interesting. I graduated from high school in 82 when you were just getting into it. And I've grown up in the business of dolls and watched all the Barbie evolution. And to me, back then, it was all about the very first vintage pieces. That was the primary, let's call it sophisticated market of the time. And that evolved really out of a lot of people coming out of their youth and starting to collect the ones they had when they were young. But that's changed a lot over the years. Can you take us on the path of this generational shift and how that's affected markets out there?
You know, the one thing I always love to put focus on is the collector itself. And like Ruth Kronk and Sybil DeWine, that were both these avid collectors, when Barbie came out, they were adults. So there was no nostalgia playing into them collecting. It was just a mere fascination with this doll. And maybe because it was tiny or it was fashion or it was, you could live vicariously through this doll in the wardrobe, it wasn't nostalgia. And I think a lot of collectors start collecting stuff from their childhood out of nostalgia. And I would say there was a little bit for me with that, like wanting to hang on to something that was such a special moment in my childhood. But there are collectors that collect for investment. And I always give a big eye roll for that because this market can be worse than the stock market. Just look at all of the people that hoarded up all the holiday Barbies. But most of them are arriving at this with documenting history, documenting fashion, the evolution of fashion. And there may be some nostalgia, but everybody's Barbie collection, it's like we all have access to the same things, but everybody kind of tailors it different. And there's just many faceted different reasons that they're collecting, but each one of them is slightly similar, but each collection becomes a very special reflection of who that person is.
Yeah, you're right. The early collectors of Barbie now, thinking back to my youth growing up as well at the same time, those early collectors, they didn't grow up with Barbie. They grew up collecting other things from their youth. They might have been collecting Nancy Ann storybooks or American composition dolls or even antique dolls, but they found this fascination with Barbie at a very early period when nostalgia had not yet kicked into the marketplace. And they began the protection of this and the research of this. So that is interesting. But there's no doubt, Bradley, we can't discount the idea that today's market is heavily driven by nostalgia.
Absolutely. I think that is very apparent even in the dolls that Mattel continues to create, because they frequently will re-release a vintage style doll. They'll do a reproduction of the number one or a reproduction of Solo in the Spotlight outfit or something. So I think there's so many people that want to reclaim their youth, or someone has heard their mother or grandmother talk about the doll that they had or the outfit that they had, and then that person wants to have that same sort of thing. So the reproductions factor heavily into today's market, but nostalgia is powerful.
It is the most powerful catalyst to collecting, and an entire book could be written on the power of nostalgia utilizing Barbie. I remember in the early 80s, nobody really paid much attention to mod period stuff at that point, did they? The collector market.
No, they didn't. And when I started collecting, that was probably my largest focus, because those were the dolls my cousin had and I was playing with. So I was fascinated with these dolls that were manufactured like 4 or 5 years before I was even born, and was trying to find those. So those dolls were fairly inexpensive. But when I started collecting, the only book that really existed was that Sybil DeWine book. And so there was no reference for the fashion. There was no reference to the costumes and the accessories that came with them. There was such a devoid of that. And that changed in the late 1980s when Sarah Sink Eames wrote the first Barbie fashion book, which documented every single costume and what came with it. So suddenly it was sort of like a shopping guide for all of us collectors, that we knew, oh, so that's what the blouse looked like. And oh, it came with those shoes and not those shoes. So it was once again a very important piece of information that made the whole collecting of Barbie feel more scholarly.
Oh, that's a great name you brought up, and definitely one of the most influential characters out there in the world of Barbie, early collecting days, and that's Sarah Sink Eames. And I'm glad you brought her up, Bradley, because I know her book is still, in some ways, I hate to say the Bible, but it's definitely one of the most relied upon books over the years. So that created a next level, but it was at the same time that you started to see a group of new collectors who had grown up in that mod period. They started coming into the marketplace. And in the 90s, I guess, was the changeover when you began to see people all of a sudden collecting mod where nobody did before.
Right. There was a focus on mod, and I think it was, like you said, the age of the children that played with that were now of an age that they wanted to reclaim it. And mod became a really big thing. And in some cases, it was performing better on that vintage market than like the bubble cuts and ponytails of the mid-60s. It has always sort of remained a very strong focus. And also, there was such variation in the mod. In the first few years of Barbie, some of the outfits would be carried over. There were some 1959 costumes that were still available, like in 62. There was a lot of carryover. But when the mod era started happening, there was very little carryover. There was a spanking new collection every year. So there was more change. There was more evolution. Collecting mod, to me, is a little more interesting than collecting the early stuff, just because there's a lot more varied outfits.
Yeah, I can see that. Bill Greening had also said the same thing in his interview, that it's the mod period that he really identifies the most. And it was interesting. I remember him saying something about all the outfits that his mother wore. That period, it just brought back all these flashbacks of his early days. And then you saw this begin to evolve now into a period that nobody really paid attention to all that much for a long time and is becoming hot. And that's the superstar period as well.
Superstar is so incredibly hot. It's so hot that next year's National Barbie Collectors Convention, the whole theme of next year's convention is Superstar. So it has really kind of come into its own, and next year will be the 50th anniversary of Superstar, which makes me feel very old.
Oh my gosh.
I was 7 when it came out. So
yeah,
I have to point something out. My friend David had said to me at one point, I was at a show and I was selling something, and someone came up and asked me from something that was like from like 1991. And I was like, no, I don't have that. And they walked away, and I looked at David and said, why do people want all of this like new stuff? This is kind of crazy. Why is suddenly there's this focus on like this early 90s stuff? This just seems crazy. And David looked at me kind of puzzled, and he said, Bradley, how old were you when you started collecting? And I said, I was like 11 or 12. And he said, Bradley, the number one Barbie in 1982 was like 21 years old. That Benetton Barbie they're asking you about from 1991 is like 32 years old. And after I sort of dry heaved for a moment thinking about how old I really was, and realized that the collecting of Barbie happened so quickly and it got so organized, and we so pride this early stuff that's just fascinating and rare and unusual, whatever, we lose sort of track that it's like the stuff from like 15, 20 years ago, no one seems to pay attention to, but there's the nostalgia that brings that into being that makes it just as popular, which I think is what's happened with the Superstar, that it was ignored. It seemed too new. No one was paying attention until they were. And now it's sort of like through the roof. Some of those Superstar dolls can go for hundreds, if not thousands. It's crazy.
Yeah. You know, it's funny about the aging aspect in collecting. Maybe it's because Barbie never ages that we don't really put it into perspective ourselves.
Right.
And we don't see it in ourselves. And then one day, you see this next generation coming in and buying things that you thought are new. And you're like, oh my gosh, they're not new. They're old. Oh my God, I'm old. And it's this revelation. I know.
I have to tell a Bill Greening story because he came to my event 2 years ago. And when he was planning on coming, I told my nieces, who are now 21 and 24, that he was coming. And he had worked for Mattel as a lead Barbie designer. And they were like, oh, well, that's nice. Well, they researched him and they called me up almost in tears. They were so excited. And they were like, Uncle Brad, Bill Greening designed our childhood. All of these dolls that we played with, the Princess and the Pauper, oh my God, he designed all of them. Well, I said to myself, I'm going to go on eBay and get pristine mint examples of the Princess and the Pauper dolls that Bill designed and have him sign them to my nieces. I was so excited to do that. So I went on eBay and those dolls were going for hundreds.
So you're in the Y2K period now.
Oh, yeah. And I was like,
yeah.
So this doll from like 2008, 2009 was like $700. And I'm kind of like, well, I love you, my darlings, but we're not buying those.
Not $700.
No, don't love you that.
Yeah.
Not that much.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. And that's really led us into the current age of new collectors are coming in with Y2K. And they're collecting the Y2K period and a lot of Bill Greening's designs in the early 2000s, and very fascinating how that's developing. So it's like every generation is expanding the Barbie market more. And so Barbie is a gateway into doll collecting. But in a way, there's also an insular aspect of the Barbie world itself that collecting the dolls of your youth directly, let's say Y2K, as the new generation is doing now, will guide them eventually into vintage, into mod, into the early period, into Superstar. So they will expand from there. Do you see, Bradley, since we're talking about this gateway and the evolution of collecting, Florence, my mom, and who always says that in collecting, one thing leads to another, which I think is so defining of everything in collecting. Exactly. It just defines everything in collecting. Yes. You've evolved into appreciating vintage dolls, antique dolls, other things. Do you see Barbie collectors going into antique dolls as well?
I will say I see Barbie collectors that are very focused, that never deviate, but so many of them will discover something else. I have friends that have gone from Barbie to Tammy and Tressie, but it's all like a 1/6 scale sort of fashion doll from that same period. And then there are people like myself that they collect Barbie, but then they've discovered 1860s French fashion, which is similar to Barbie, just separated by like 100 to 150 years, and that it is a doll with a trousseau of wardrobe of clothing. So I think anytime you're involved in collecting anything and you're going to like a doll show, you will see other things that will fascinate you. They may be completely different than anything that you're currently collecting, but I think going to auctions and going to doll shows and just seeing what all is available, it will catch your interest. Things will fascinate you and you will jump down another rabbit hole, because sometimes, like with me, I've collected Barbie for like 45 years. You get to a point where you have most everything you've sought out. You have what you love. You have what you like. So you have to start getting more focused. Like with my Barbie collecting, I just got back from National Barbie Collectors Convention. And I will be honest, I bought very little, which sometimes panics me a little bit. But I'm looking for things like the ephemera, the historical, the documentation, and that stuff doesn't turn up that often. But what I love discovering are other dolls from the period, other interesting things, and then the camaraderie is always fun. But Barbie is sort of the gateway drug to everything.
It's an important conversation, and you bring up a lot of things that we've talked about in other podcasts. I did one called The Road of a Collector Should Never Be Straight. And that is ultimately that Barbie, yeah, you could probably spend a good lifetime collecting, especially if you started late, 30s, 40s. But there is a certain point in every category, if you are specific within that category and stay in it, it gets stale after a certain amount of time. And it's not stale from a sense of you don't love the objects, you still love them, but collectors got to collect, and you need to complete those sets, I say in quotation. And there's a certain point where you just can't find much of anything else, and then it becomes less fun. And so that's why you should expand into other things. And for Barbie collectors, I think the natural extension of Barbie collecting is going into other fashion dolls. For sure, that's the low-hanging fruit. But going into even the 19th century, as you mentioned, in French fashion dolls. Every time I look at a Radico and Cadonnier, I know you know this doll well from the 19th century. I always joke, oh, look, it's the first Barbie.
Exactly. The posing stand,
the
everything.
Posing stand,
the
everything,
bust.
the holes in the bottom of the feet, just like the first Barbie. And why would a Barbie collector not include some of these into their collecting, into their storytelling of dolls, into their storytelling of Barbie itself, as to keeping their collecting more fresh? I think it's really important, and I'm glad you brought this up. Yeah, I do see people who are crossing back and forth between Barbie and antiques quite often, and I love it. But Bradley, you've done something else, I think, that's really interesting that I bring up as an important part of the experience of collecting. You know, we talk about keeping things fresh, and I love to find and help collectors with always keeping their collecting fresh and exciting. And you are a wonderful example of someone that, while you've been collecting Barbie since you're 11 or 12, and you've got a lot of things that you really wanted over the years, you keep it fresh by doing research and becoming an historian in many ways. And I know you have a new book coming out. You've done a number of research projects on Barbie. You've worked with Anne Ryan, the daughter of Jack Ryan, the father of Barbie, who I had on the podcast earlier. So this has become almost your new focus. Can you tell us a little bit about what drove this need for research and some of the exciting things you're discovering and where this is taking you as far as this new book?
I will say that I have a sort of natural curiosity. I am fascinated with process. I always want to know how or why or when, the backstory on everything. And when I was a kid and you were going to Kmart, on the back of the Barbie outfits that would have this like text describing, and it was CJ of California designs Barbie's wardrobe, and she uses the best fabrics and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, well, who is CJ and how do you get to be this Barbie designer? How does that happen? So I knew that early in my youth, but then when I discovered that Barbie's first fashion designer was Charlotte Johnson, and she kind of started it all, I was fascinated to learn more about her. And I discovered that there was so little written about her. I mean, she's afforded like maybe half a paragraph in Ruth Handler's biography, and other things reference that she was Barbie's designer for a period of time. And so I've spent a lot of time interviewing as many people that had known her or met her and doing a lot of research to discover who she was and what she was. But that research sort of led me to discover other Barbie fashion designers. And so I've been collecting these stories and collecting this documentation. I've purchased archives. I've purchased file cabinets from former Mattel employees and gone through things. And it's been an amazing journey discovering all of these names that are associated with the creation of the first Barbie doll, the first wardrobe, and how they continued with Mattel. And so many of them are sort of unsung, unknown, never mentioned. And I decided that I kind of wanted to change that. I wanted to bring a little bit of the spotlight on them. And I had recently met Anne Ryan, and she was wanting to do a book about her dad, and I helped her a little bit with that. I wrote the foreword for her book, and she shared a lot of her archive of information, which filled in some of the gaps in what I had. So it's really sort of become a thing of discovering all of this information and always knowing I wanted to put it together in some form of book that's going to tell these stories.
And it's fantastic what you're doing. And you're working on a new book, and I think you're targeting it coming out in 2027. Can you share with the listeners here today a little bit about that?
Well, it's going to document a lot of Charlotte Johnson's history and the setting up of the production of the Barbie doll in Japan. And many of the Japanese people that helped with the project and the Americans that traveled to Japan to set up that production and those first few years of how it all sort of came together. That's my focus, but it's going to be filled with stories of some of the designers that came after Charlotte, because she became the manager of the department and oversaw other designers, and they had anywhere from like 3 to 6 designers at any one given time working on the Barbie brand. So it's a fabulous history that's filled with a lot of characters.
I'm excited to read this, and I have become personally fascinated and going online and reading a lot about Jack and Charlotte's early days in Tokyo. They would spend months there at a time in some cases. Charlotte
spent almost an entire year there setting up this production. She stayed at the Imperial Hotel, which was sort of a Western style hotel in Tokyo, and they kind of turned it into her design atelier, and she had an assistant, Fumiko Miyatsuka, that would help sew everything and create all the samples. So she stayed there for about a year, and Jack Ryan would go back and forth, but there was Seymour Adler, who was also in the research and design department, and Frank Nakamura, who was second generation Japanese American, who went over and was helping out there. The benefit of that is he was bilingual, so he spoke Japanese and understood the culture. So he was immensely valuable to this project. And so they pretty much held up in the Imperial Hotel and were nose to the grindstone going to make this Barbie project happen.
It's such a fascinating story. And the two hurdles ultimately being that at first, Jack Ryan was tasked with the impossible, that nobody could make this doll, but he managed to figure it out and find someone who could. And then Charlotte was tasked with the idea of who could make small enough costumes for this particular body. And at first seemed impossible, but they overcame it. It's wonderful. And I'm so glad you're focusing on that other part of the story. And thank you for all the historical work and research. And I know you've been going back and forth to Japan as well.
Yes.
In your research. And you've kind of fallen in love with Japan, haven't you?
I love Japan. The times I've been there, I stay for between 18 and 20 days. And the culture is just so amazing. I love so much about it. I adore it.
And it is intertwined so much with the history of Barbie and really with dolls in themselves. And I think one of the things you also collect are antique Japanese dolls, but of particular size and genre.
I love the Ichimatsu dolls, which sort of represent like a small Japanese girl, but they have to be under 8 inches. I don't want them large. I like small. So talk about being sort of laser focused.
Yeah, exactly. But definitely one thing leads to another, because that's a vast difference than Barbie and shows all of your range and where you've gone. So as part of the project of not just the research and becoming an historian on the subject of Barbie and dolls in general, and there's other areas that you've done research on, but you have really worked hard to be accessible to sharing all of this knowledge with others. And one of the ways that you do this is you're the only guy I know who has a whole convention centered around him. But it's not really. We all joke, and it's taken on a nomenclature, I guess, if that's the right word, of being called BradleyCon. Why can't I have a convention named after me? Because nobody would come. That's why. But they come to yours, and they love this annual gathering you do in North Carolina. Tell us the origins of this, what it started as, and what it's become and evolved to.
Well, I find it very difficult to refer to my convention as BradleyCon. It started as what I call the Swell event because my business is the Swell Doll Shops, and we decided to create an event, I think starting in 2016. And one of my doll clubs had wanted to do a regional conference, and they were plotting and planning. And I said, well, before we do something so big, we should do like a luncheon, just a small luncheon. And we'll learn how to work together. We'll each kind of take on a different role. I said, I have enough dolls. We can use the dolls as our souvenirs, and I'll do the program. I have someone that can sew the costumes. We can have centerpieces. We can do all this stuff like that. And I was very excited with this idea. I could share my research, do my program. My doll club, however, was not very enthusiastic to do Barbie. And so I kind of came home and was complaining that it's like, oh, they don't want to do a little Barbie luncheon. And so my husband, Chris, said, well, then why don't you do it? And I'm like, well, club would be so easier. I think a club needs to do this. And he says, probably you can do this. And so I talked with a couple of friends, and we had my very first luncheon, 2016. I had 38 people come, and everyone had a marvelous time. I shared some research. We had a little sales room and stuff. And everyone's like, well, when's the next one? And so it has become a yearly event, and it has grown to, we have 130 people that come. It's a 2-day event now. My friend Sean has coined it to be BradleyCon. We have brought in guest speakers. We've had Bill Greening come and speak. We've had Anne Ryan, whose dad was Jack Ryan that invented the Barbie, come and speak. So we've really made it a very scholarly moment where we share the history and the passion for over 6 decades of the Mattel Barbie doll.
It's a wonderful gathering. I went there last year, and I really had a great time. It shows the potential of how these gatherings, they don't even have to be massive conventions or big festivals or anything, that you can have these very niche-oriented groups coming together for 2 days. And it can be just as effective in its outreach, in its enthusiasm, in collectors coming together and sharing passion. And you've done a great job with it. It's a great event for anyone who's interested in future ones. It's an annual thing. And I know you welcome any Barbie collector, but it fills up fast, doesn't it, Bradley?
It does. We always take a deposit for the next year event at the event. And generally that night we pretty much sell out. So I wish I could squeeze more people into the hotel or grow a little bigger. But right now we're sort of at a point to where we're doing almost as much as we can actually handle. So we usually record our programming and we share it virtually. So we love not just doing it for a small group of people. We love the outreach, and we publish some of that on YouTube. So we're trying to figure out how to make sure that this history and this legacy for these folks get shared and that people remember their names.
Your Swell event, or BradleyCon, I think that the intimacy of it, being like 100 people, I think is around the amount you take.
Yes.
That intimacy of it is actually its greatest asset, in that it really allows a coming together. But if you like bigger events, there is another one for you too, and that's BarbieCon. That's an annual event held in different cities around the country. And I know you just got back from one last night, actually, and you're on the podcast here. And BarbieCon has become huge, and this is definitely accessible for collectors who want to get involved in the community, learn more. Can you take us back and tell us a little bit about the evolution of BarbieCon? Because it has become, it's like 1,000 people now at this convention.
Sure. I just got back from Austin, Texas. BarbieCon, we had around 900 attendees, and it takes place over about 4 days, and it is like a Barbie party on steroids. There's room shopping, there's programming. I was this year's program chair. I organized all of the programs, and we had some great speakers, and we learned a lot of historical things about Barbie. The Mattel designers show up and do signings, and the thing that everybody loves is the Saturday night banquet. We always have a special doll that's designed just for the convention by Mattel. That's always an exciting thing. And With a lot of organizations, including my own, we also raise money for charity. And this year, the convention raised $138,000 for a local organization in Texas that helps children in need. So I think that's incredible. So along with filling our collections with amazing dolls, we do a little good in the world, but it's such a great opportunity for the community to come together. And you can go to BarbieCon and hang out with 899 of your closest Barbie friends.
Tell us some of the things that you find very unique about BarbieCon that makes it very different than other conventions you attend.
It's very community oriented. Prior to the convention starting, they do what they call room sales. They open up their hotel rooms. Each room is like a little Barbie boutique. And although it seems like it's just sort of a retail focused sort of thing of shopping from room to room, it is the best opportunity to meet dealers, meet other collectors, and make friends. It is such a sense of community for those few nights and days that they're doing it. And it also gives you an opportunity to see some of these dolls and costumes and accessories in person, up close and personal, that never turn up. So it's a great moment for learning and experiencing. It's a lot of fun. And the first convention was 1980. I think there were maybe 150 at that first convention. And they've consistently held that convention every year. And I think in 2030, it'll be 50 years of Barbie convention. So it's an incredible organization that puts it on, and it's a lot of fun.
I'm looking forward to attending myself at some point, and hopefully next year or the year after, and seeing this, because everything I hear from people is just wow. And I think because they just fling the doors open and anything goes. And so I love that idea. And I've always said that for conventions to thrive in the future, new generations of collectors, they don't want old school conventions. They want Coachella. They want a full-on party.
Right.
They want Burning Man and that kind of thing. So this is where I think BarbieCon has really evolved to have that aspect of it, just being hey, everybody, the door is open, let's have a blast. I love it.
And what is so interesting also is they don't just focus on collecting and shopping. They have a lounge where they have karaoke, they have like a little dance party, there's like photo ops. So it's a whole happening. It's not just sort of scholarly Barbie focused, even though I would love that. It's a lot of fun.
That's wonderful. There is a generational part of Barbie collectors. It's broader than compared to like French fashion collectors of the 19th century, though we are seeing younger, actual millennial and Gen Z collectors into the antique market, Bradley. You'd be interested to know that I just talked to two different collectors, don't even know each other, two different parts of the country, both in their 30s, and they are collecting primitive Americana dolls and Schoenhood.
Wow.
So it's starting to expand in our market as well, which I think is important. But Barbie, what has helped it is it has so many different generations. So their new generations come in and kind of freshen things up with conventions and the way things are done and prepare it for the next legacy moment as it continues on. But that leads to the question then, and one I have for you, because like me, you've been through all of the changes over the years. And I'm going back to remembering in the beginning of this podcast when you talked about the old days of buying, you got a list of Barbie things for sale and you had to send a check and wait a month for the item to come. And now the internet has clearly changed all of that. I mean, eBay was a huge moment of shift and change for Barbie and bringing the marketplace right to your doorstep and virtually instantaneously. And then you now have social media. And you and I have been through all of these changes. So more important than anything else, social media, how do you think that has helped, hindered? What do you think it has done to collecting?
I really think suddenly we're a global entity of collectors. We can communicate with collectors in Japan, in France, in South Africa. I have collectors all over that I network with and chat with. And 1986, Bradley starting to collect, that was impossible. That just wasn't a thing. And even then, it was the telephone bill, because, the long distance bills that we used to get years ago to have like a 15-minute conversation with your friend that was in another state, that leached into your doll budget. So now with the way technology has advanced, we can really communicate across state borders and around the world that really kind of brings the community together. So I think social media has been a great thing. And then also with things like Instagram, I think Mattel as a company has gotten involved and kind of created an account for Barbie, the Barbie style on Instagram. It's given us an opportunity to kind of look at Barbie as sort of like a personality and what she's doing and what she's wearing. And so they create a whole thing for Barbie's Instagram, which is really kind of cool. So I think it's been a great benefit to the greater collector community, and it's become far more entertaining than just sort of the stodgy old way we used to do things.
Yeah, there are things that I think have hindered community aspect of collecting in social media, and, that's the drama. But on the whole, it has been a huge benefit to people kind of understanding, and I'm not talking about other collectors, I'm talking about the others, people who don't collect, having a better understanding and respect of what it is that is behind this passion for three-dimensional figurative art, dolls, Barbie, whatever you want to classify it as. One of the things you just mentioned about Instagram, and I think about how photography and doing vignettes, and Barbie is a perfect example of something that comes with so many accoutrements. I mean, that was the whole premise of Barbie, is you could create a world with her. And people doing photographs and sharing them online show the power of social media in having the ability to express those things, where before you just did them in books and they were typically insular in your community. Now the world can see it. And so it is so beneficial. And I'm seeing that extend into the antique dolls because, as you know, vignetting, as I like to call it, has become really the cool, hip thing now in the world of antique dolls, and especially with French fashions. And people are sharing those, and the others are looking at it and saying, oh, wow, this is really kind of cool. And I think that's bringing in younger collectors. So I'm glad you see this as well. And it's a good conversation to have as we watch social media develop these new collectors over the years.
I totally agree. And at my event this year, we actually created photo spots that people could bring their travel doll or their mini-me and have a setting to put their doll in and take a picture for their Instagram or Facebook. And BarbieCon does that as well. They set up all of these little miniature photo spots. So the photography and the Instagram and Facebook has been such a great way of sharing and creating that sense of community, which I think is just really amazing.
Absolutely. And it's the future of collecting, not just with Barbie, for everything. Speaking about everything, Bradley, clearly the concept I originally had of doing everything but the B word with you, it would have been a very short podcast. But I do want to touch on some of the other parts of Bradley that are out there that people may not realize. And you touched on it a little bit earlier, but can you go into how Barbie evolved, or what happened that you got into some of these other categories in the antiques? Was there somebody that inspired you, or was there some of your research that led you down the rabbit hole of other dolls, or how did you get there? And what is it that you're collecting as well as Barbie nowadays?
It's kind of funny because when I started collecting Barbie, I turned to, so this is like early 80s, so I turned to the one thing to do research and learn about things that we had at the time. And Google didn't exist at that moment, nor did the internet. So I turned to our set of World Book encyclopedias and turned to the D volume and looked up doll. And in that particular entry in that volume, it showed historical dolls and contemporary dolls, but it showed a pair of Kate Cruza dolls, and it showed a antique French fashion doll, a China doll, and it had a lot of things about the history of dolls all the way back to Roman. And I was fascinated with that. And I probably read that entry 100 times. And when my parents passed away and we, had to clean out their house, I kept that volume of the encyclopedia. I think I told myself when I was probably 12 years old that one day I would own an example of everything in that. And so I do have Kate Cruza dolls, not just for that reason. I find them very charming and important. I think it sort of documents an obvious sort of evolution in how dolls were made and how dolls look. And then also with the French fashion, recognizing that it is a doll with a wardrobe and how it represented what people were wearing. So there's a lot of things just from that first sort of like research moment that inspired me that has stuck 45 years later that's still important to me. Meeting people like my friend Caddy White, when I met Caddy, she was probably 80 years old, and she had been a long-term collector. She'd started collecting in the 60s. And when she started asking me what I wanted to collect, I said, well, I want to collect French fashion. And she's like, well, you're starting at the top. Usually collectors work their way up. And I was like, well, what should I start with? And she was like, well, there's Armand Marseille, and then there's the Violet Baby. And I was like, well, I don't want any of that. You know, I want glamour, I want fashion, I want style and accessories and trunks and all of that stuff. So she would let me come and go through her collection, and she would show me things and teach me about things. And what I didn't know is like the women in her doll club that had known her for decades had never even been invited in to see her collection. And so I just happened to mention, oh, I was over at Caddy's and we were looking at her antique French fashion doll collection, and she has a doll from a la Poupée Nuremberg, and she had this and she had that. And they were like, what do you mean you saw her collection? I didn't realize how special what she was sharing with me at that moment was. But then I understood that she was very private and kind of secretive about her collection, but she saw something in me and she wanted to share it. So she really kind of helped mold me as a collector. And so one day I asked her, what is your favorite doll in your collection? And she said, well, I love the Maggie Bessie dolls that were made in Winston-Salem, North Carolina at the turn of the century. And I had no idea what they were. So she pulled out the 3 that she owned and shared them with me. They were handmade cloth dolls that had oil painted faces. They were very simple, very charming, and very rare. And so I studied those and was instantly fascinated with them. And I did a whole research project on those, not only to learn the history of the dolls and the full sisters that made them, but how to make them and studying how to create that same pattern and stuff. It was really fascinating and completely the antithesis of anything I'd ever done.
Yeah, I mean, Maggie Bessie, you can't get further away from Barbie than that. And now, leading into current generations of collectors, they have a huge cult following of people that are fascinated by those dolls and the Full Sisters. I actually got to meet one of the family members some years ago, great-great-granddaughter, and lives in San Diego, California now, and we got some pieces that we sold. I know that one of them ended up in the UFDC museum, actually. That's another interesting early pioneer collector that took you under their wings and helped you develop all of this knowledge that you have taken back now and are sharing with others. I think another person that you mentioned to me in the past in our conversations was Susan Serkis and how she influenced you as well.
Well, Susan was, for lack of the terminology, an absolute doll. And the first moment I met her, I don't know if she recognized something in me that I didn't even recognize in myself, but she sort of took me under her wing. And Susan was very active in the doll community starting in the 60s, and she was a part of the UFDC organization. She was a president of the organization. She was just a very passionate person, not only of the doll, but of costuming. And she published a series of books called the Wish Booklets, where she would select a particular style doll or a size doll and would create a whole wardrobe in these little booklets about that doll. I think her first publication was like in 65, and she made like a 1860s wardrobe for like a 12-inch doll. And I bought one of these books and was looking at it, and she was like, Bradley, I know you like Barbie. Let me tell you about this pattern set. She said, I wanted to buy a doll from a doll artist named Martha Thompson. And I was married and had 3 kids, and that doll, which was like maybe $50, was just not in the budget. And so I decided that if I could create a set of patterns that would fit said doll, other people would want to buy that book and would sew for the doll, and then I would make the money off of the patterns that I could buy the doll. So she got on the wait list to buy this doll, and she published this little book. And I think she sold like 100 copies of it so she would have enough money to buy this doll. And her husband, Mike, came home one day and saw her writing notes and putting checks in an envelope. He says, "What are you doing?" She says, "Well, I had 100 of them printed, more than 100 ordered the book, so I'm returning their check." And he goes, "Why don't you just print more?" And with that simple conversation, her wish booklet business started, and she produced over 30 different volumes of her series, and she went from printed technology to digital technology and covered all kinds of dolls, from 1920s flappers to French fashions to pegwood dolls. She did a little bit of everything, but I think she saw in me that I had this varied interest in costuming and sewing and fashion. And she says, "I'm going to let you in on a little secret." The first one that I did, she says, I chose a 12-inch size doll because I figured people would sew for an antique doll, but they would also fit Barbie. And so I took that issue home and literally made a wardrobe of like 1860s costumes for one of my Barbies. But we became instant friends, and we were friends for years. And she had an eye, she had a vision, and she had seen the collecting world evolve over decades before I was even a collector. So she brought a lot of knowledge and history to me. And once again, shared a lot of her insight, which really kind of formed the collector and the person I am, who loves to share what I've learned and discovered.
I appreciate so much how you have always given credit and respect and highlighted some of the mentors that you've had over the years and how you carry on that tradition yourself as well. It's a beautiful story, the relationship that you have had. And so far, I've counted 3 pinnacle figures in your life that have really influenced and shaped you as a collector and given you this happy life of a collector. So, Bradley, that takes us to my favorite part of The Curious Collector, and that is Hot Takes. Oh, Bradley, I'm sorry. That's our new music we have for Hot Takes. It was not my choice. It's not my choice at all, but everybody said that has to be the music. It is not my style, but I guess they're trying to keep things young and fresh as we appeal to a younger audience. Okay, well, good. Anyway, for the Hot Takes on this, I'm going to ask you, Barbie movie, your thoughts.
I thought it was amazing. I've seen it about 10 times. I love it for a multitude of reasons. I have a couple problems with it, just in general, but it was amazing.
What do you think it did for the doll world and the world of Barbie?
I think it really shifted a lot of focus to Barbie. I think it kind of gave people permission to let their Barbie flag fly and be a Barbie collector. I think it really did us a favor.
Okay, hot take number 2. That is Barbie, doll or pop culture?
Oh, that's a hard one, Stuart. For me, it's always going to be Barbie doll. The doll is the important aspect. It is the thing.
Because I wonder how many people kind of think of Barbie in the light of being more popular culture than anything else.
I think she's evolved into that, but I'm sort of like the origin thing. I like the doll and the premise behind how you play with that doll more so than it just being like blonde hair and hot pink.
So the last question for Hot Takes is, when you look at a doll, not just Barbie, but any doll, you look at that, what draws your eye first? The face, the form, or the fashion?
I'm going to say the face.
So interesting, because the reality is fashion is one of the things that you're really zeroed in on within your collecting, that it shapes you a lot in your choices. But I've always argued that, yes, fashion is the thing, but ultimately the face is the first thing everybody looks at.
I will always say you can change that outfit. Well, and it's so funny because you can line up 10 number 3s, number 3 Barbies from 59. You can line 10 of them up, and I might like 2 of them. They're all the same doll. They might all even have the same hair color, but there's such subtle differences in the face that there are some of them that are just, they just speak to me, and then some, like I wouldn't give you a nickel for them. It's just really funny how, for me, it always starts with the face, because like I said, you can change the outfit.
Now, this is an interesting topic entirely on its own, and something I've touched on quite a bit in previous podcasts, and that is how the market has changed so much in that the presence of a particular model is far more driving of value than just the name of what it is. So you said a number 3. I imagine there was a time in the early days of Barbie collecting, let's go back to the 80s when you began, that they kind of had a set price and it didn't matter the presence. That was the price of this particular model. And now I know with the antiques, and I guess you can share with me whether you think it's so with Barbie. I'll give you an example, a Jumeau Triste. You know what the Jumeau Triste is, and the long-faced Jumeau sometimes called.
Yes.
And an example is Fran Sorolla in San Diego has probably 40 of them. Now, some we've sold in her part 1 auction, but at one point in her collection, she had like 40 of them lined up in the room. And you're right, every face was different. There were some that, they were nice, but just didn't really have that pop, I call it. And then there's some that just, they stood out in a room full of dolls. They just popped. And people don't price them now just on the level of it being a Jumeau Triste. They price it emotionally and how they connect to that face. And so it's really important what you're saying. Do you see that as potentially happening with Barbie now?
Absolutely. When I started collecting, a beautiful number 3 was like $75 to $100. I mean, it was like, that was like the price for them. And that was at a time you could also get a number 1 for like $500. Hello, bring me a time machine. But now with
everything.
Now with a number 3, there's like some variances in how the eyes were painted and the color of the eyes. And there are some that you could say, great skin tone, blush. That might be a $3,000 doll now, where the average price of a 3 right now is $900 to $1,200. But every once in a while you get that doll that's just so beautiful, so exquisite, so amazing that it wouldn't shock me for it to go for $3,000 or more. It's just so gorgeous.
Exactly. And that's the point. Collectors have become very savvy and evolved in this now, in understanding it's not the model as much as it is the presence. And the sky's the limit. When you have a doll that just pops, that's it. And from a collecting standpoint, to get those dolls, sometimes you have to go to battle and sometimes you got to pay whatever it takes. And
Absolutely.
So that's the new shape of the market. And it's interesting that even Barbie, it has evolved into that as well. And this has been just a fabulous conversation, Bradley. And I always enjoy talking with you anywhere we meet each other and see each other. You are such a vibrant part of our community in every different world, from the antiques to Barbie to, I know you also collect, coincidentally, Bradley dolls.
That's my guilty pleasure, my little secret. Now the world knows.
Now the world knows you collect. Now, for those of you who don't know what Bradley dolls are, this has nothing to do with Bradley. This was a company I believe, started in the 60s, right? Bradley?
Started in the 60s. They started in Japan. I think ultimately they moved to Korea. Press cloth face, big painted eyes. They were meant for like a decorative object. And they started out very mod, and then they became like, you saw them in like these big Southern bells or costumes. And
right.
I think the first one was given to me as like a little bit of a joke, like, Bradley, here's a doll with your name all over it. Well, I was fascinated with them and started collecting them. And I do have standards. They have to be amazing. They have to be incredible and a very unusual costume, but I do have quite the collection of them.
They're very kawaii looking. They have that over the top. They're interesting dolls for sure. I've just exposed you into the world of Bradley doll collecting. All right. So I want to end this with one last question to you. We always end every conversation with a collector with this, to give you a time to kind of reflect and look back on your past and your years of collecting, and pose a question of, if you could go back to your younger self and write a letter to that Bradley in the 80s, this starting collector, what would you tell him based on what you know now?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say, wait for it. I think when I started collecting, I would buy whatever. And I think I felt that if I didn't buy this then, I may never find it. But I was probably buying something that was not in the condition it should have been in, or that I didn't really want it, but I felt like I should have it. And I would just say, wait for the right one. Because probably 5 years after I started collecting, I started selling to afford my collection. And I was selling all of those goofy things that I probably should have never bought in the first place. But wait for the right one.
That seems to be a recurring theme with a lot of collectors, is if you can write a letter to your younger self, it's patience. Be patient.
Yeah.
And especially if you're starting young, you have the advantage of time is on your side, and this can be a really multi-decade pleasure for you, and there can be a lot of great times ahead. So just be patient and enjoy, and good things will come to you over the lifetime of collector. Great advice to your younger self and to new collectors coming in, Bradley, younger collectors as well, into this joyous hobby. It really has been wonderful to have you and for people to hear, not just in the Barbie world, but the general collecting in the antique world, your entire story. It's a fabulous one. And we look forward to your new book that will be coming out next year and to your continuing work across the field in research. Thank you, Bradley, so much for being here.
Thank you, Stuart, for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.